Hello everyone and welcome. My name is Ryan, aka Ryantist the Scientist. I am on a mission to empower and inspire everyone with knowledge and fervor of the natural world. Maybe you have some questions, and that's great. I'm here to answer them for you. So let's do that together here on another episode of Ryantist the Scientist. Welcome back. You're here. I'm here. We're here for part 2 of Kill Your Lawn. This episode is the follow-up to the first part of a conversation that I had with Danny, who works as a restoration ecologist in and around New York. Has done a lot of really, really cool projects that have been super impactful. Was recently featured on the Xerces Society for Invertebrate Conservation for his project that we actually are talking about in this episode. So that's pretty awesome. Without further ado, I want to get right into this. But before we do, we listen to motorcycles go by, and we also say thank you. So thank you for listening to Motorcycles Go By with me, and for tuning into this show. This show and all of its components are part of the reforestation project that we're all a part of. You, me, all of us. We're all a part of it. And each episode that is published is another tree planted. The proceeds, a percentage of the proceeds for each episode goes to funding the planting of trees in perpetuity in Appalachia to do some reforestation there, and as well as other national parks that have experienced deforestation, as well as around the world. The science store on my website, Ryantist.com, you can pick up all of the cool science stuff that you love there. There's even some things available relevant to this episode for you to pick up, and each item that you purchase also plants a tree. So thank you for being a part of this project. Thank you for supporting the show. You can also support on Patreon every month, as little as $3. Your contribution each month goes to support the show and also plants a tree every month. So that's pretty awesome, if you ask me. And now, without further ado, let us enter into this episode of the show, Kill Your Lawn, Part 2 with Danny. One of the things that, well, it's a statement and then a question. One of the things that I've seen often is like attempts at making like improvements to biodiversity by doing lawn conversions. And like a really popular one that I've seen is by like making clover lawns. And I'm curious to know what I think I know, but I'm curious to hear your thoughts rather on like those kinds of like projects that are like somewhat adjacent to what you're talking about, and like what you think about those kinds of things.
Yeah, no, certainly. That's actually great, because I had a friend, former colleague, that we had just gotten back in touch this week, and I was sharing about the exciting opportunity to talk with you today, and she brought up clover lawns. And again, I think it's kind of I don't want to say like hierarchical, but starting at like a paved surface, lawns are just a paved surface, and I think some of these clover spaces are just above lawns. Again, providing some nectar, some flowering, obviously, but again, most often they're still a very limited nectar value, pollen gathering, and a lot of plant and insect relations are specialists. There are certain insects that are only going to be coming out certain times of the year, or that require a certain genus or type of flower community, and they might only be out for a few weeks. And some of the clovers, there's a seasonality to some of the flowering, but again, it's most commonly it's still kind of another monoculture in a sense. So they're providing some value. I would say not enough, which is again something, but it's not providing a seasonality, a plethora of nectars, and that coevolution aspect. I think a lot of it always kind of comes back to coevolution. A lot of our native pollinators and insects that we're trying to support um, aren't adapted or evolved, and some of them, especially kind of thinking non-natives, certain clover lawns, they're not adapted or even capable of processing some of the nectar or getting the right nutrient or getting the right sugar or protein value that they need to survive and procreate and support future generations. So I think,
It's like I can eat a bag of potato chips and be full, but if I tried to eat bags of potato chips for the rest of my life, I would get sick and die.
yes, that's a really cool analogy there. Just like the documentary Super Size Me, you can't keep
Yeah.
all the
Super
time.
Sad changed my life.
Absolutely. So yeah,
Hmm.
again, even with lawns and clover lawns, carex, like grass-like plants that also
Hmm.
do technically have a flower and create a fruit. Um, these are great alternatives, but they're still just not there yet. They're still not serving as much value as doing some of these conversions in lawns or invasive spaces to get diversity, to get uh, across the season nectar value, specifically
Yeah.
again insects and pollinators that would use those spaces, or even birds.
Yeah, birds.
But
Oh,
birds,
birds.
seed sourcing. There's benefits across the seasons.
So what are some examples of like plants that like fit those requirements, like spring, summer, fall,
Yeah.
like diversity within like the seasons? Like what are some of the plants that are like your like go-tos that probably wouldn't be super hard to find?
Yeah, I think most often I've been a major advocate over the last several years with projects I've been a part of, the organization I've been working with, um, to source certain types of what we refer to as spring ephemerals, the certain wildflower communities more often associated with woodland or forest habitats. Some that are more sun loving as well, but providing these early flowering plant communities like Virginia bluebells, trilliums, trout lilies, celandine poppies, woodland phlox. There's a lot of early flowering plants that you can source with certain nurseries. You can also order bulbs or tubers, rhizomes, different roots, vegetative plant parts that you can plant in the fall or late winter that you can actually find it. It's out there. Sometimes I think one thing to reflect on in sourcing some of these native plants that are going into these projects, they can sometimes be a little bit more pricey up front, but the
Mm-hmm.
benefit pays off over the years, especially as they establish and reproduce in your space. And so, like, really, that spring ephemerals. I think thinking about seasonality, that's my go-to. Trying to get a mix of stuff that's growing forest edge, kind of meadow adjacent, providing that early pollinator value. Certain bee species that are only out for a few weeks in May or early June that really need it for their reproduction cycles. And that really kind of then leads you, I think, into some of our most showy or attractive. I think for the summer months, I'm a major advocate, obviously, for milkweed, the Asclepias genus. So I certainly encourage individuals to explore any opportunity for, especially monarch butterflies, other pollinators that will use the flowers themselves, but looking at common milkweed, swamp milkweeds, butterfly milkweed. Those are like your three most common in the local nursery trades, as well as ones that you can get seed, mail order seed as well if you're not doing mature plantings. And then really, you're going from spring to summer, and then getting into late summer and fall, the goldenrod communities. So many different species of goldenrod out there. Most people have the misconception that they are ragweed that you often see in allergy commercials, but this is one of the biggest late summer fall pollinator, like rich nectar value that a lot of insects need before whether going dormant, laying eggs, or migrating. I
Yeah.
certainly encourage. I'd have to say those are go tos in a season. I have many more actually. I'd love to share.
We could talk about native plants or native like flowering plants for forever. What about like non-perennials? Like if you were gonna do would you incorporate non-perennials into a space like this, like shrubs and stuff like that? And if so, what would those look like? Or what would they
Oh,
be? Not what would they look like? Or you can describe them because I'm sure they're pretty.
oh, absolutely. I mean, I would certainly think, in the word non-perennial, that leads my brain into two directions. One, native annuals,
Mm.
um, certain plants that are on a reproduction cycle of 1 year and they're not regenerating from root each year. There's one that we use a lot, especially in restoration of like more meadow spaces. Partridge pea, Chamacrista. It's actually a nitrogen fixer, so it's a yellow flower. It's filled with especially bees throughout its growing cycle. But this is one that takes atmospheric nitrogen gas from the atmosphere, and it converts it into organic nitrogen. So it's essentially self-fertilizing the soil and the conditions around it, which is phenomenal, especially as you're trying to get some more nutrient value into some of your spaces. But again, thinking of the non-perennial or non-typical like shrubs, stuff that's flowering. Um, yeah, I like to think of it again from plants that are maybe growing adjacent to meadow, forest edge, different viburnum species that are flowering, witch hazels, service berries. These are some more flowering or showy at certain points in the year, especially more spring or early summer. But there are many that, like witch hazel, for example, is flowering in winter at points where you get these sparks or warm ups that sometimes you see certain insects out. You don't quite know what they are or where they came from or how they're alive in that little warm blip in the middle of winter.
Mm-hmm.
But those are often tied to that mutual relationship. They're there for the only things that are flowering, and witch hazel might be one of them. So yeah, they're very showy opportunities that you can use, especially bordering a lot of these spaces.
Are there any like how would I say? Like if you had to pick okay, this is what I want to ask.
Yes.
The so there's like lots of different plants that you're talking about. Are there any particular types of plants that are like underrepresented in this kind of work that you would like to see like more use of?
hmm Yeah, I think in a lot of it, especially with like meadow or wildflower spaces, I think it kind of ties back to that last question. I believe the incorporation of these like flowering woody shrub species, especially in thinking of kind of like island geography or biogeography, like having these pockets of shelter for birds, other insects, boring insects, connected in or parallel or side by side with these meadow areas. I think it's not actually used enough. I mean the project which we were talking about a little bit earlier, most recently, and kind of tying back to upper management and generational differences. Um, we were trying to utilize some of these flowering shrub species that would border, providing windbreak shelter, nectar value, attractiveness for the public. And we were we were suppressed in the opportunity to because of landscape architecture and aesthetic over, I think, very aesthetically pleasing and environmentally friendly benefits. So that project actually we were prohibited from utilizing because of this. I think it's more of an ignorant move.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think it's necessarily out of malice, but one a little bit of a letdown. I think that's an area I would encourage individuals to explore that non perennial option, that flowering shrub um, that you could have in, especially in more forest restoration. Major
Yeah.
advocate for forest restoration.
I want to like pivot like slightly, and it's not lawns, but it's kind of lawns.
Mm-hmm.
And like I want to ask you like a few questions about, or like before we run out of time, um shorelines and like living shorelines, because they to me fall into like the same category of like a widespread management style, that's like a single serving widespread management style, like a lawn to be like, we want a space, it's a lawn. We want to have like a coastline, it's like riprap so that you can like walk right up to the edge of it and have
Yeah, it's
like
like lumber.
whatever.
Yeah,
Yeah, and that like I know that like you mentioned earlier on that you had like experience in this universe of like coastal areas and restoration, and like I was wondering if you could speak a little bit to like the the problem that exists with this kind of like application to coastlines, with like the way that they're like built or built upon or managed, and like what is like normal for like a northeastern, generally speaking, like a northeastern coastline to actually look like, and why.
it's funny. I'm really close to this pollinator project that we're working with. We have a naturally occurring patch of soft shoreline where there's the endemic, the native plant communities naturally occurring, different salt marsh grasses, upland shrub species, and this is a space that is, it's really the original makeup, especially here in New York City. The predominant coastlines were made up of salt marshes and upland coastal marshes. And now across the city, all five boroughs, we have less than 1% of our coastlines make up this habitat when it was the dominant type pre-colonialism. So in this space,
That's a
and you talk
tremendous shift. It was
terrifying.
the majority, and now it's just like 1%.
I mean, if you think about it, lots of Brooklyn is built on top of former salt marshes.
Right.
Jamaica
And
Bay
like Canal Street used to be like a canal.
now, and up in Inwood, there are marsh restoration projects that are there, but they're
Mm-hmm.
Inwood, East Harlem. So much of it used to be marshland. I used to live 102nd Street in East Harlem, which was at the top of like the bedrock, looking down, and you could see the flatlands, which would have been almost the entirety above 103rd Street, were marsh and stream coastline. But going back to your question, that one prescription fits all, hardening our coastlines with what's referred to as riprap or boulders, rocky edges. Um, that again, it's providing some protection, especially storm surge, velocity reduction. It is some habitat. Certain mollusks, bivalves, and vertebrates can attach, become sessile, but again, it's not providing as much benefit as a natural shoreline or the concept of a living shoreline utilizing the native diverse plants that would be a living sponge, pollutant filtration, storm reduction, erosion reduction, mitigation. And It's funny you mention it because like we have these in a lot of the parks and the spaces that here along the coastline in the city. We have a lot of areas that are just lawn, all kind of coming back to lawn again, abutting, eroding coastal edges, or just riprap, and not ones that are working with nature. This idea of working with nature and restoration again, where the plants are providing all those values of storm mitigation, sea level rise, but also the habitat, the educational capacity. Like, I mean, to approach a rocky shore edge, you can bring a school group and talk about how those rocks are slowing a storm, but there's not much of a conversation around it.
Yeah.
It's doing this one thing. That's it. Versus all the other benefits of a natural system.
I can remember like a very specific circumstance in which a meeting of the minds about like an erosion problem at like what you were just kind of talking about, where like a bunch of grass and a bunch of boulders and a bunch of water all like are together, and the all of the like boulders were visibly like slid down from where they had initially been planted, or not planted, placed,
Yeah.
and like the lawn coming up to them, like you could see where like the die off was from where like the salt water and the lawn were like meeting, because all the rocks had like collapsed, and like erosion was like actively taking place. The rocks had been placed there probably, I think, no longer than 5 years before then, maybe a little bit longer, but definitely less than 10 years before then. And there was like at least like a like 1 to 2 foot amount of like eroded and like damaged coastline where all this stuff was like happening. And the
Yeah.
conversation was about like what to do and like the proposed idea, and two things which I think you're going to think are funny. One was that the proposed solution was to just like add more rocks, and that would stop the rest of the rocks from like falling into the river. And then the second thing, when the idea about like recreating a natural environment that is resilient to erosion, which is like a living shoreline, like a marsh or a wetland, that I was told by the powers that be that there are no such thing as plants that can live in brackish tidal waters, which is what
Oh,
where the area that I was at is, which is like brackish tidal waters, which like is not true, because there's,
absolutely not.
I'm sure like a plethora of plants that specifically and exclusively exist in brackish tidal waters. Um,
Mm-hmm.
so like my that example to me was like why I personally kind of like relate this topic to lawns, because it was like very clear to me about the like um we're going to do
Misconception.
this thing to like make this thing anything to keep it the way that it is, like the status quo, like the residual kind of like leftover idea about what this space looks like. And like it's an area of the that's like prone to like flooding, like storm surges, like the at sea level is where all the storm surges are the worst. Like, duh. So like whatever you can do to like mm, make it better like feels correct. And
Well, I think you might do the idea of like, especially with the coastal edge that's rock and lawn, and we're seeing rocks slumping off, we're seeing erosion still happening on the backside. Let's just keep adding more rocks. I think maybe you're getting to a point too of like what's a middle ground when one side is completely misinformed, I think, in certain ways, and the other is trying to again work with nature. Um, I mean, if for an individual, I think working in a coastal area, especially with storm severity, storm surge, sea level rise. I mean, I think at a bare minimum, in a site that you described with rock and lawn, I would majorly push for those upland coastal shrubs that take salt inundation, that hold your shoreline in. Add rocks on the water side if you're at a bare minimum doing that, but you're at least providing some shelter for certain animals. You're providing some nectar value. You're providing still benefits, and you're also stabilizing your bank. I know if someone doesn't think that there are brackish salt marsh shrubs, I would prove them wrong. I'd give them the information to show that there is
the list
whether
of
they
them.
accept that or not, and the resources at hand to really confirm what you're sharing. But yeah, I think in an ideal situation, when those are your limits, those are your bounds, I would say put in those upland salt marsh shrubs. For just if you're not doing a full fledged living shoreline, that's a soft, wet marsh going up into drier coastal upland marsh.
Yeah. Could you kind of like expand on what that looks like? Like if you were to do or like to try and recreate what like a marshland, like living coastline kind of an environment is, like what does that look like? Because I feel like it's one of those like terms, like living shoreline is one of those terms that kind of like falls prey to that like buzzword thing of like,
Yeah.
because there's like a lack of specifics around it, it like means lots of things, different things to lots of different people. So like what does it that like look like from like the water to inland?
I know, absolutely. And I think I'll just preface it with that my background in living shorelines or coastal restoration is more closely tied to brackish and estuarine environments, but with that meaning that there's some degree of salinity or salt from ocean or tidal straits. But so in a lot of this, it's a topographic gradient. So as you described, from the water at your lowest point, 0 feet sea level, increasing somewhat minutely, but in just maybe the instance of several feet, going from the water line up to kind of an upland edge, where in this, at the water line, you'll have, based on your mean tides, your soil conditions, you would have most often marsh grasses. So different Spartina species, cordgrass species that are growing in this intertidal zone. Twice a day is flooded, but also 2 periods during low tide are out in dry conditions, establishing their own peat sediment and real root conditions. And that's your most wet space, this intertidal zone, the low marsh. And as you're moving up in that gradient in inches to feet, up to drier conditions, you're getting into this high marsh that has certain adapted grasses that are related to a lot of the plants that are growing in the water line, but that they're in their typical dry conditions. So they might be able to take storm surge, that 100-year flood. They're what's really holding the drier upland areas intact. So there's also Spartina species that are evolved in those conditions, and related grasses and other forbs, other herbaceous plants in that high marsh zone. But again, it's not being flooded daily. And just above that, you get to your high marsh conditions, which are certain drier, bigger grass species like your switch grasses, blue stems, different coastal Gerardii, different rushes. And in that's your driest of grasses, and where you start getting more of your woody shrubs. Now there are some woody shrub species that do grow in also the low marsh, but that's generally dominated by these water adapted grasses. But in this drier upland, this is where your real edge and most risk of erosion with storm surge occurs when you're out of that kind of living sponge zone in the lowest portions. But in that upland edge, that high marsh space, those shrubs are what really holds in the surrounding soils, sands, whatever your substrate or your soil ground type is made up of. And in that, you have like different groundsel shrub, different like not choke cherry, excuse me, beach plum. There's different shrub species and some small tree communities that are going to start establishing there. So I think if you're picturing it virtually, visually, you see grasses in a water line with a hill going upwards with more grasses and woody shrubs and small trees, scrub coastal tree communities. But yeah, think of it as like a curve going up to visualize it.
Mhm.
I hope
And
that
like,
that was a
yeah,
ramble. Hopefully
yeah,
it
no,
gives.
that's perfect because like it's I feel like that's like the visual that like myself and I think like a lot of people are like missing of like what it looks like in its like entirety because
Mm-hmm.
like you can recreate like portions of it to serve like various purposes or whatever, but I feel like my or at least like my specific visual I feel like was like more on like the incomplete side, so that is good. um so like when all of these things that you just like described are in an area, like when they are there and they exist and they are established, what benefit does that have for like a place like a coastal city like we live in, or like pretty much any eastern and western and southern like body or like city, like or settlement on a body of water? Like what benefit does that have versus the like harshness of like riprap or like a seawall or just like boulders at the edge of the water?
Yeah, I mean they're essentially a sponge. Like the really as incoming water, high tide, moderate storm surge to severe 100 once in 100 year storm. These are places that are adapted to take a beating, that can handle the conditions, can handle salinity, and they're really this space that is going to reduce the chance of flooding. They're going to reduce the infiltration of storm surge. Um, they're going to reduce velocities. They're going to inhibit or stop erosion. There's really a multitude of benefits, and they're filtering out a lot of the pollutant or even some of the, not necessarily just the microscopic contaminant, but the trash, the plastic. They're filtering a lot of that out of the water, which is more important to get out and help doing coastal cleanups, cleaning up trash that's in these spaces. But yeah, versus a hardened wall, rocky edge, um, it's basically blocking um, the like absorption or dissipation of the storm. Like, yes, you might be able to reduce storm surge or reduce the velocity, but eventually that water is going to make it over, or it's going to be displaced elsewhere. It's going to flood into a neighboring community that doesn't have those benefits, that doesn't have that protection. I think there was the talks of, like in the Netherlands, creating in the New York Harbor storm gates, sea level rise storm gates. Now that's wonderful
At like the edge of New York Harbor, like by where like the Verrazano Bridge is.
near the Verrazano. So yes, that's where some of the original proposals were. But if you think about that, yes, that might help reduce the major impact in the more affluent regions of Brooklyn, the Battery, downtown Manhattan, and all along the coastline. But what happens in those areas or those communities that aren't affluent, that aren't protected behind those seawalls? Um, the water's got to go somewhere. If it's not being absorbed, it's not being dissipated. It's just being met with a barrier. Um, it's going somewhere. It's not a full solution. So I mean, the more creation of these kinds of habitats, I think the more reduction, the more mitigation for a lot of these issues tied to sea level rise, storm surge.
Could you
Um,
even do that? Because, like,
what put up a gate?
yeah, like putting up a seawall at, okay, putting up a seawall at, like, the entrance to New York Harbor by, like, Staten Island. How could that work if there's an entire river emptying out into, the estuary that is New York Harbor and then, like, out into the ocean? Like, how could that
I think
ever
there's much
work?
they ever could. I think there's much
It's
bigger
like no
physical.
water can come rushing in, but then all of those, like, millions of gallons per second that are coming all the way down from, like, northern Canada have nowhere to go, and then it would flood anyways.
Yeah, these are some. I'm not calling out entirety Army Corps of Engineers, but you and the levee systems there, which were in place, and these kind of practices, or a lot of the Army Corps of Engineer funding that's going into the East River currently in New York City. Um, they're fighting. They're working against nature, not with nature.
Yeah,
And
didn't Java in, like, the Indonesia have a similar, I think it was Java, but there was, like, a city that had a similar proposal for making, like, a seawall that they'd be able to close. It's like a harbor city, so that, like, when there were, like, tsunamis, I think was their big one, to, like, stop, like, the water from, like, coming all the way in, or, like, have an impact on the water. And one of their big concerns was the pollution that, like, then everything would be trapped. I think Venice also had the same proposal for, like, a seawall, or that would, like, open and close to prevent, like, flooding and all that fun stuff. But, like, that the other part of it was then, like, you're, like, all the pollution gets, like, trapped in that body of water, and it can't, like, dissipate out into, like, the ocean, especially in, like a hurricane, where there's, like, all, and, like, flooding and, like, all this, like, stuff, including, like, sewage during, like, CSOs that are probably going to happen at the same time as, like, a hurricane, that they were, like, trapping on one side all of the, like, polluted water, and the other side is, like, it's one of those, like you said, like, working against nature rather than with it, to be like, by trying to solve the problem, you're, like, creating, like, a second and third, like, much larger problem.
it's so true. I think that's probably like my biggest piece right there is what you just repeated. Working against nature, not with nature. In
Yeah.
restoration, I think you gotta, again, we're not gods, but I think you gotta try to nudge it, work towards
Yeah,
a
like,
natural system.
work with the laws of physics rather than against them.
Yeah, like you all.
I mean, I guess that makes sense. So you talked about, like, some of the plants and stuff that would be in these, like, coastal environments. Um, what about, like, localizing that a little bit more for, like, an individual? So, like, let's say if I were to have, like, my own property that had a stream that was going through it that was, like, not correct. Or that was, like, how do I say, like,
Climate change is changing a lot of fluvial, like a lot of stream
yeah, that's, like,
pattern.
altering the landscape in, like, an undesirable way for
Hmm.
like, similar reasons, like erosion, and, like, it's starting to, like, meander in, like, a way that I don't want it to, et cetera, et cetera. That, like, what, if anything, are the kinds of things, like, is that, like, in this universe too, like, stream restoration?
Oh yeah, freshwater systems. They're very much in a similar wheelhouse. Yeah, I mean, like here in New York State, like there's a really great program through the state Department of Environmental Conservation called Trees for Tributaries, or TRIBS. which is planting out appropriate shrub and tree species in what is referred to as riparian or like wetland or stream corridors. So utilizing like the appropriate plant communities and with biodegradable um, protections, like so utilizing things like coir logs, jute netting, these systems in tandem with planting can help stabilize banks, establish biomass below ground that can help retain your hillside along a stream or your edge along a stream, reducing the amount of sedimentation, the amount of soil or suspended particulate that's in your stream, benefiting the wildlife communities that are utilizing that stream, and also like saving your property from eroding away too, in a sense. So there are programs out there, and there are freshwater systems and plants in place that can certainly be used as well. Yeah, I know a lot of the conversation kind of started going in the direction of brackish salt marsh because you and I live walking distance to the Hudson River, but there are equivalent or similar
that are like specifically for that kind of an environment.
Mm-hmm.
So it would be just kind of like a scaled down version of a similar thing. Like if you were trying to do like coastal restoration in the Hudson River, which is like a huger river situation that's like more complex, it's like the same thing, just scaled down with different types of plants because there's like no salinity.
Yeah, I mean, and even if you're still using the Hudson River as an example, I mean, really, once you go north of Beacon, New York, unless it's like a drought year where the salinity does creep up a little bit higher north, but like the stream bank of the Hudson River restoration, or these concepts of living shorelines along the Hudson River in New York versus Tivoli Bay or just near Albany, are completely different plant communities, but very similar practices and installations too. But still all part of the same water body.
Yeah.
You know? It's really interesting. I mean, and in restoration work, in horticulture, in homeowners' property, whether it's public, private land, I think one thing that comes up a lot in my experience is the conversation around using ornamental, non-native, or also known invasive plants in garden spaces or green spaces, and that people say there's really not a native plant to the Northeast region that is equivalent or showy or providing the colors that they want or the heights that they want. And I always argue like it just takes a little investigation. There are ample substitutes for non-native or invasive plants in the horticulture or garden trade, as well as in the restoration trade. But like there's always an option that provides you similar condition needs, similar colors, similar growth, some almost identical in appearance even.
Yeah, I have this sort of conversation like pretty frequently about that very thing, about like, if a temperate forest exists here, it also exists over here. It's a safe assumption to assume that over time similar things have cropped up in both places. Like
Yeah.
it's not out of the realm of possibility that like, that like terminal uniqueness of like it's not so special that like there isn't another purple flowering plant that blooms in the summertime that's 3 feet tall. Like
Yeah.
there's nothing that special.
And I mean, they're in the same genus. They're just different species, but they're from
Right.
like
Yeah.
it's very related, but
Yeah.
not explored enough.
Mm-hmm.
Or it's what the gardening trade, a
Yeah, it's like
nursery.
industry driven, like what is that word? Like artificial scarcity or whatever. Of
Yeah.
like, you buy this because we told you to, and that's what we are providing.
Yeah.
um, okay, so in kind of wrapping everything up, if I were someone who was like, who was listening to this, and I wanted to start to like investigating what like restoration work is and like what it looks like and how as like a novice I could like start to get involved and feel like I was actually like doing something, like what's a good avenue to point somebody in the direction of to like start that journey to see if it's something that they can follow through with.
I mean, I'm certainly an advocate for local programs and also like nationwide or global programs, but one that I think can give you an insight to restoration is the Society of Ecological Restoration, SER. That's very regional based, but also nationwide. And there's a plethora of information, research, reports, trainings, webinars. I think to be a member, it might come at a certain fee, but um, relatively attainable. There's student memberships, of course, too, for anyone young in a program that's studying. But that's a really great one that I would direct those specifically interested in restoration. But in terms of like really grassroots, getting local, of course, looking into your local parks, nonprofit partners or friends of groups, um, looking for opportunities for volunteering. Getting actually out into a green space near you and getting involved. But really, I think it just depends on your level of curiosity or engagement or free time or mobility or physical ability in it as well, or if you're just wanting to study practice and concept. But go local and explore nationwide programs, especially when it comes kind of like thinking back to like pollinators or wildflower programs. There's things like Pollinator Pathway, which is a program that's specifically through a lot of homeowners that are connecting individuals to wildflower restoration in their properties and becoming a bigger part of a network that you can get registered through when you create wildflower habitat in your property. There's Monarch Way Station, which is studying monarch butterflies while providing habitat for them. There's a lot of ways that you can get involved, big and small, and also talking to people like us, or um, just informing yourself through even a simple Google search, so to speak.
I love a Google search.
But Google,
hmm Okay, so is there anything that you didn't get the opportunity to say that you think is like an important like concept or idea or anything that you didn't get to like hit on that you want to toss out there in the universe?
yeah, I think it's important to know, and some of these topics and some of the conversation pieces we had today, they can come with adversity. They can come with some scariness, so to speak, where, especially when you're thinking of climate change, it can be easy to get into kind of a doom and gloom. Um, but no matter how small your contribution or your advocacy, anything, anything is helpful. So, like in theory, like for example, on my block that I live in New York City in West Harlem, um, I I'm not able to necessarily make a big change in the street trees here, but I cast wildflower seeds into all my tree pits,
Mm-hmm.
and some of the tree pits, depending on the usership or if they're fenced or not, um, I'm seeing wildflowers growing in them now this summer. So
Mhm. This is reminding me of like a thing that one of my friends said to me that I haven't thought of in like a while, but it's like very much reminding me of this, is that like he would always say, um for every like good thing that you don't do, that's one less good thing that exists in the world.
yeah.
And that's like the same kind of thing, that like no action is like too small. It's like for everything that you don't do because you think it's too small, it's like one less.
Well, that's a good thing out there.
Yeah, it's one less like action that happened in this world. I
Yeah.
love that.
Say, don't be scared. Try.
Yeah.
Something.
Okay. And finally, where and I'm gonna like add this into like the show notes and everything, but like where can people find you to like follow your work and see the kinds of like stuff that you do, and maybe some like images or like other media regarding the kinds of things that we talked about that you do?
Yeah, I mean, from more strictly a professional capacity, I mean, again, we mentioned maybe a little earlier, but LinkedIn, searching me through Danny Molinaro, which will be a restoration ecologist in an orange plaid shirt with a smiling face and a beard. You're welcome to follow me through this platform, but also even I do often in some of my personal social media. In Instagram is probably my most regularly used currently. My username is at suga.dan, and suga is the genus of eastern hemlock, and it's spelled T.
Is that what that is?
That is the genus of eastern hemlock. Suga canadensis is the Latin name, scientific name for that tree. It's a tree that's tattooed on my arm. But in my Instagram handle, it's at tsuga.dan in Instagram. And I post a lot of my projects, but also a lot of related content and some of my adventures in life, which you're welcome to enjoy too.
Fun. Well, thank you very much, Danny.
Thank you. Thanks for the opportunity to chat today.
I had fun, as per usual. Had fun talking to you about the stuff and the things.
Absolutely.
If you have questions that you would like to ask, call into the show. That phone number is 347-470-4144. Again, 347-470-4144. And remember, there are no questions that are too big or too small. Music for the show was created by Julian Giamma. I want to say thank you so much for working with me to create such a fun song, and thank you everyone for listening and for supporting the show. See you all again next week.